Hello, I'm Andrew Moll and I'm the Chief Inspector of Marine Accidents, and I've been asked to come and talk to you about some of the lessons that we can learn from recent accident investigations. Before getting into that, a couple of words about the Marine Accident Investigation Branch for those of you who have not come across us before. So the MAIB is one of three accident investigation branches that the UK has, all hosted by the Department for Transport. You've got ourselves, set up in 1989 following the Herald of Free Enterprise disaster 2 years earlier. The Rail Accident Investigation Branch, which was set up around about the turn of the century, or just after the turn of the century following the nasty rail crashes about that time, and the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, who've been around since the Wright brothers first started plummeting over 100 years ago. We get our pay and rations from the Department of Transport, but the chiefs all report directly to the Secretary of State, and we have functional independence for the purposes of our investigations. Crucially, we are separate from the modal regulators, so the MAIB is separate from the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. We have three main aims. The first one, fairly logically, is to improve the safety of life at sea, learning the lessons from accidents to make recommendations to stop them happening again. The second one is to satisfy the public in general and the maritime community in particular that marine accidents are being properly investigated. And the third one is that we have international obligations to investigate some accidents, and the Marine Accident Investigation Branch fills those obligations on behalf of the UK. So what do we investigate? Well, UK flagged vessels anywhere in the world, and the inspectors are always very keen to get out to the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, particularly in the summer, but it doesn't always work out like that. We'll investigate accidents. We can investigate accidents involving any vessel in UK waters, which basically is within the 12-mile limit. Includes merchant ships of all sizes, commercial fishing vessels, leisure craft with some caveats, and accidents to people or occupational accidents. We put around 1,200 cases on our database each year, and we aim to publish around 25 full investigation reports, which are publicly available. They're on our website, and hard copies are sent out to the key stakeholders. This is what keeps us busy. You can see from that slide there are 31 investigations ongoing. For those of you keen to do the maths, you'll see that the maths only add up to 30. There's a one investigation which isn't on there for various reasons. Looking at the colour code on that pie chart, you can see that merchant vessels and commercial fishing vessels give us by far the bulk of our work, around about 2/3 between them. And the final third is made up a mix of small commercial craft, leisure craft accidents, and other accidents. And typically in the other accident at the moment would be the Haverfordwest paddleboard accident. It doesn't really quite sit in small commercial or leisure. So I've lumped it into other, but that's typically the sort of thing that would sit in there. Unfortunately, we are to an extent driven by outcomes, and therefore it won't perhaps be a surprise to you that of the 31 investigations that we're dealing with at the moment, 26 fatalities are included in those investigations. That's not 26 single fatality investigations. I think the most we've got is a quadruple fatality, which interesting is the paddleboard one. So not every investigation is a fatality, but it is a key driver for whether the MAIB will become involved or not. So moving on to today's topics. First one is carbon monoxide poisoning, and perhaps I ought to have in brackets after that again. The second one I want to talk about is pre-RCD craft or older craft. And the third one is a bit about rib seating, rib manoeuvring, some of the lessons we've learned from investigating rib accidents over the last year or so. Starting off then with carbon monoxide, the silent killer. Quite a few sources of carbon monoxide on board, and the first one, perhaps obviously for those cabin cruisers and so on that have got cooking facilities, is the cooker. All of us are pretty good, I guess, at looking at a hob and seeing whether there's a nice blue flame on each of the burners. But how many of us look under the grill to see if the jets are blocked and whether we've got a yellow flame indicating poor combustion, or indeed look around the oven to see whether the oven is burning cleanly? Poor combustion can lead to high production of carbon monoxide, so cooker definitely a source of concern. Heaters Yes, same sort of deal. Poor combustion if it's not serviced properly, and the other thing is that if the burner exhaust is not run correctly, then there's a risk that the exhaust can leak out from that and into the cabin. Generators, especially portable generators with ad hoc exhausts, similar problem with the exhaust leaking and therefore escaping into the cabin. And I would say that both with heaters and generators, the problems we're seeing are with DIY installations, where fully qualified, properly certified installers are putting things in. They tend to be done quite well because A, they know what they're doing, and B, they're checking for leaks as part of the setup. But DIY installations, not always the case. And as I've already alluded to, if the systems are not serviced regularly, again, you could end up with a poor burn. Main engine exhaust leakage, well, again, that's typically from a weak exhaust bellow, something that's corroded or cracked over time, letting carbon monoxide escape where it shouldn't be. But the final one, which is the one I want to really go on to talk about, is main engine exhaust, which is leaving through a proper exhaust system over the side or up, and but yet the exhaust gases are re-entering the boat. And of course, one of the problems of carbon monoxide poisoning is that the symptoms can be quite hard to detect sometimes. Not dissimilar to the aftermath of a good night out. Headaches, bit of nausea, perhaps a bit of breathlessness, but then the collapse, dizziness, and loss of consciousness. You've got to be on your ball to recognise that you're suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning, and obviously alarms will help there. So a quick primer on the effects of carbon monoxide at different concentrations, and you can see there 35 parts per million at the bottom, permissible exposure level, no apparent toxic symptoms, right up to the top, over 10,000 parts per million, death in 1 to 3 minutes. The thing about carbon monoxide is that the effects are cumulative. If you think about the alarm that you might have in your house, a domestic alarm, if you've got one, it will go off very quickly if there is a high concentration of carbon monoxide in the atmosphere, but it may go off much later if there's a low level of carbon monoxide in the atmosphere, but cumulatively it's counting away, and when it gets to a certain level, then the threshold level, usually around about 100 parts per million, it will go off to tell you that you have more carbon monoxide in the atmosphere than is good for you. And just looking at this table before we go on, around about 2,000 parts per million, you are looking at unconsciousness very rapidly and death within a few tens of minutes. So I just want to lodge that level in your minds at this point. So looking back at some of the cases we've dealt with over the last few years, starting at the bottom there, the Arniston case back in 2013, double fatality. That was a portable generator with an ad hoc exhaust setup that was leaking carbon monoxide into the boat. Love for Lydia, double fatality as a consequence of main engine exhaust gases getting back into the boat, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Vasquez, the same. Diversion, a heater in board, which was the exhaust setup from that which was leaking. And Emma Louise, which is the reason really that I'm raising this today, because this accident only happened a couple of weeks ago down at Hamble Point. Another 2 fatalities under investigation at the moment. I can't say for certain it's carbon monoxide poisoning. We're waiting for the post-mortem report, but what I can tell you is that we've been down there looking at the boat, looking at it with gas meters, and we are getting some quite horrific CO readings, and all the indications are that this was another carbon monoxide poisoning event. I said I'd say a bit more about the Love for Lydia case, and this happened on the Norfolk Broads a few years ago, 2016. Husband and wife who were found deceased, along with their dog as well, unfortunately. And they were alongside at Roxham Island, and the engine had been run for a while, presumably since it was due not to heat the boat but to charge up the batteries. The canopy was fully rigged, and the couple were found deceased inside by a passing waterborne trader towards the end of a weekend. we got involved and we started looking at the carbon monoxide that was being built up. And what we found was that although the exhaust was venting naturally overboard, burning at the stern, it was a standard wet exhaust. What was happening was that these exhaust fumes were getting back under the canopy. And if you look at the top left-hand graph there, you can see, and it's a bit difficult to see on this scale, but the scale of the left-hand side, the big flat line at the top, the blue line, is at 2,000 parts per million. And it reached that level within about 2 to 3 minutes. Very rapid buildup of carbon monoxide in that helm area, and it stayed up there. Took a little longer to build in the accommodation area, 6 to 7 minutes, but again got up to 2,000 parts per million. And the reason it flatlines there is because that's all our meter would read. We have got other meters which we're using on this current case, but 2,000 parts per million, as I said, that's more than enough to be fatal in a few tens of minutes. And I think the bottom graph is interesting as well, and that's just how much carbon monoxide is being detected by meters on the jetty adjacent to the boat. So really quite serious spikes, fortunately transient, and again out in the fresh air, so not too much of a problem. But if you stood there for too long, then the buildup of carbon monoxide in the system might start to become a problem. The problem continues to exist underway, unfortunately, and that's because of something called the station wagon effect. So even when the boat is making way and the wind is perhaps the relative wind is forward to aft, what you can end up with is a vortex at the stern, which then turns the exhaust gas and pushes it back forward. And again, if you have a canopy up of some description, the exhaust gas can get under the canopy and can build up in the cockpit area really quite rapidly. So carbon monoxide, unfortunately, a perennial problem. Every couple of years, we're seeing another double fatality, lots of safety messages going out. I'm raising it again today because I think this is the current case is going to be another one, and you'll see safety bulletins coming up from us before too long. Moving on to my second topic, and this is well, I've written that pre-RCD, but it's older leisure craft fatalities. And again, I put a small table up there showing what we've got here, a single death, a triple fatality, another single and another triple fatality. All the reports on our website, and it isn't just the older boat issues, there are lots of other safety issues in there, but I wanted to focus on the older boat issues today. This is one of the boats involved in the most recent accident, the Norma G. It's a Norman 18 Mark II, and in fact, it's involved in two of our accidents. The other one being the Troan accident, which is another Norman 18. Looking at it on the trailer there, it looks quite a tidy boat. It was bought by the owner before the winter as a bit of doer-upper, and he spent the winter putting his heart and soul into it and turning it into something that looks really quite smart. And I think for a boat of its age, it's probably in pretty good condition. So what about the accident? Well, this is an entrapment fatality that happened at the top end of the Camel estuary back in May 2020, MAIB report 13 of 2021. So the right-hand graphic there, you can see the coast to the north of Padstow, and the owner, his wife, and two children had set off for a day at sea, going to have a bit of a joyride, sightseeing, bit of fishing, picnic, and so on. And we got their act together. They'd set off, and they'd gone round to Travone Bay, which you can see sort of in the middle of that the top right-hand chartlet. Unfortunately, there was a west-northwesterly swell running into the bay. Didn't look too bad, but as the water shallowed, the waves increased in size, and it became pretty clear to them that Travone Bay was not going to be a good place for them to spend the afternoon or spend the day. So they decided to move into the estuary to where it was a little more sheltered. And on the left-hand side, the bigger chartlet, you can see it says approximate anchor position. So they came around inside Stepper Point and anchored there, and father and son got their fishing rods out and started doing a bit of fishing, and mother and daughter went down into the cabin and started doing a bit of cross stitch. Nonetheless, it was still a bit lumpy in there. The boat was rolling around quite a lot, and at the point at which the owner decided he was going to top up the fuel tanks with a bit of petrol, and the petrol fumes got inside the cabin, everyone agreed that it was, it was all a bit nauseating, and that they would move further up the river before they had lunch. They got the anchor up, headed east towards the main channel, and in doing so, unfortunately, moved into the area of steepening waves as the swell approached the Doom bar. A large wave caught them from behind, crashed into the boat, and rolled it over. The daughter, unfortunately, was trapped in the cabin, and although subsequently rescued, she didn't survive the accident. So that's the story in a nutshell. And if you want to read more of it, it's MAIB report 13 of 2021. But why am I raising it here? Well, it's some of the features of Norma G and the other boats that I mentioned in accidents we'll be looking at that I just want to bring to your attention. If you look at the right-hand side, it's not what it shows, but what it doesn't show. And that is that there's no secondary means of escape from the cabin. The only access is to and from the cockpit through the main door. And so if the boat is stern down in the water and you're trapped in the cabin, you've got to swim down and out to escape. There is no other means of getting out of the boat. Sort of thing you would see on a boat built today. Left-hand side, I think that picture speaks for itself, and that is the cutaway transom in the vicinity of the outboard motor. Deep cutaway, no internal bulkhead, pound board, squash board, whatever you want to call it, to keep the inside of the outboard motor, to keep the height of the transom up above the 400 millimeters. It ought to be, to try and reduce the risk of waves coming over the stern. And a number of the accidents I've talked about, not this one, but a number of the others, the accident happened because the prop got fouled on a line. The boat ended up anchored by the outboard motor, stern to the waves. The waves very quickly came over the back of the boat, swamped it, and then it capsized or foundered. So that's the second point. And the third point is that boats at this age tend not to have any inbuilt buoyancy. And as a consequence, they will not float in the swamped condition. So a number of facets to older boats that are worth being alert to. And the reason I raise it here is that if you're training aspirant power boaters, particularly those who are thinking of buying a boat, getting a float and so on, these sorts of conversations, perhaps in the walk round of the boat part or during the discussions of the hull types and drives, always worth having a little bit of value add that you could perhaps put there that will raise their safety consciousness. The third one is, well, I think we're all probably pretty familiar with it.
It's where we get wet. Are you all right, mate?
I should perhaps have given you a warning about the fruity language before that video clip. But that's quite an old one now, and I think it's available on YouTube, but it gives you an impression of what happens when a commercial rib ride falls off a wave pretty quickly. But the first issue, is my sort of third section, is about motion-induced injuries. Characteristics: boat impacts the water heavily as a result of traveling too fast in the prevailing conditions, or deliberate wave and wake jumping. And I think the picture on the right shows that pretty well, actually. The consequence of that is that passengers in unsuitable seating suffer compression fractures to the lower spine, typically in the lumbar region L1 to L3. And if you happen to be young, typically under 35, there's a fair chance that you'll recover quite well. But older passengers and those with pre-existing spinal conditions can be permanently disabled. The medical description of this typically is a wedge compression fracture, and I think you can see that quite well on the left-hand side, where one of the vertebrae has been compressed on the right. It's actually just been crushed as a consequence of the boat's motion. So how does this happen? The mechanism of injury is reasonably well understood now, but I think no apologies for going over it again here. Left-hand picture, you have a vertical shock that comes up through the seating and into the pelvis, and that transmits itself up into the spine. If the spine is in a nice straight line, then the compression is well distributed through the body, and that's what is the body's designed to do when you're walking, running, jumping, and so on and so on. But if you're seated, and particularly if you're seated and twisted or hunched, then the spine is not in that nice straight position. And what happens then is you end up with these wedge compression fractures. And again, as I said, typically in the sort of the L1, L2, L3 area. So seating, a big issue for me. I have a particular issue with people sitting on tubes. I think it's probably okay if you are doing a slow speed trip out to put some divers in the water or something like that, not necessarily ideal. And I also have a particular issue with bench seats because of the posture that you have to sit in a bench seat, and you can't get your legs tucked under you. The handholds aren't ideal, and so on. So seating, unfortunately, every year we see a lot of accidents and incidents. We don't necessarily investigate all of them because some people manage to walk away or not spend too long in hospital, but we do investigate them repeatedly, and they are injuries suffered from boat motion and poor seating. Second area is falling overboard.
I've been speaking to a local vicar who captured the aftermath of this horrific accident on his phone. He was out walking with his wife. He had no idea at the time, he said, what he was filming. He just saw the boat circling out of control, and he also...
So this accident, again, actually in the Camel Estuary, a Maybank holiday, family of 6 out there for a fun day on the water, 2 adults and their 4 children. And unfortunately, when they had changed over helm just before the accident, the new helm had not clipped on the keel cord. A little bit of power and a tight turn, and they managed to get the rib to hook. The keel dug in. It rocked into the vertical very quickly and ejected all 6 members of the family into the water. The rib continued to circle. It ran over a number of family members. It killed Dad. It killed one of the daughters. Mum lost her leg, and the son very nearly lost his foot. So a completely tragic accident, and largely in this instance because the keel cord was not attached. Had the keel cord been attached, there is a good chance that none of them would have been injured.
I've been speaking.
So, falling overboard, passenger falls or is ejected from the boat due to violent motion in the prevailing sea state. We see quite a lot of that. Wave washover, that was a fairly new one to us, but last year a couple of people were washed out of a wildlife sightseeing trip. Boat reasonably close into to the cliffs, everyone looking at the seabirds and seals or whatever it was, and a large wave came from behind, washed straight over the boat and took 2 of them into the water, quite close to the cliffs, and actually really quite dangerous. Slamming and, or as I've just described, a spin out or a hook. Passengers usually get wet and suffer minor bruising or abrasion, but if they're hit by the boat, then the head and upper body injuries are most likely, but all parts of the body can be impacted. And as this slide shows you, people in the water hit by fast-moving propellers are likely to suffer severe injuries or death. These 2 characters are very lucky, actually, when you consider the possible consequences of a propeller strike from an outboard motor. The next one I want to talk about is side impact collision. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of this. This case that I'm just going to talk through is Osprey I and II, a fairly low speed collision. But unfortunately, we're seeing quite a few accidents where fast boats are operating in close proximity in an uncoordinated manner, and they are coming together with actually really horrible consequences, quite often fatal consequences. Fortunately, not in this accident, but let me just talk you through it. So what we have is a low speed collision. These 2 boats are going out for a wildlife sightseeing trip. They're following a large boat, and their normal routine is to sort of take a station, one on each quarter, and then as the trip proceeds out towards the sightseeing island, the 2 ribs accelerate, both turn outwards, cross behind the trip boat, and come back up alongside on the opposite side to where they started. they're crossing behind the main boat and typically doing sort of 25 or 30 knots as they do so. On this particular day, the ribs start off on opposite sides to the sides they normally start. So as they come to the crossing position, there's confusion. I'm normally on the outside, but the cold rig sail should be on the inside. What do I do? Going through both skippers' minds, they have the presence of mind to pull back the throttles because manoeuvring isn't going to get them out of it. And the two boats come together at actually not much speed, probably 5 or 6 knots, if that. But one of the passengers sitting on the tube and the bow of the rib strikes her, and as you can see from the list of injuries on the left, these boats are heavy, and it doesn't take an awful lot of crushing to do a lot of damage to the human body. 2 broken collarbones, 5 broken ribs, punctured lung, laceration and bruising to the back. The lady was in an induced coma for 3 weeks and has permanent damage to the sight in both eyes as a consequence of this really quite slow speed collision. So side impact collisions, characteristics: the impacting craft rides up over the other vessel and at higher speeds can completely cross it. And I think the picture here typifies that quite well. What we have is the bow of the boat that's approaching, just bouncing a little bit. It's not going to take much of a bounce for it to be in a position to completely ride over the sponson of the boat that's where the photograph's being taken. But also, if you look at the boat that's approaching and look at the freeboard and the passengers, they are completely vulnerable to a side impact collision. Anything hitting the boat is going to ride upon the tubes and is then going to be straight into the passengers. And as already described, passengers in the impacted craft can suffer severe upper body and head injuries, and as we've investigated a number of times, including death. So the final part of this somewhat horrific tour de force is a rib collision with a lateral buoy. This is the Sea Dogs accident that happened in August 2020. We issued an interim report just, I think it was around about April last year, and the final report is about to go out on consultation. This is on the left here is a still taken from a video which was taken by a passenger on a red funnel ferry, and it's just before the rib hits the buoy, doing about 38 knots at the time. And on the right, you can see the track that the rib had taken before this particular accident. And I put it here because for those of you who've not seen the interim report, it's a cautionary tale. The rib has spent the most of this trip doing what you do on a high-speed trip, which is trying to make it exciting, and that means tight turns and passing close by things. So some very tight figure of eights, a number of other tight turns, and passing very close to large lateral buoys at high speed. The consequence of this is that later on in the trip, having done a few wake jumps behind a red funnel ferry, the skipper of the rib is looking at the ferry, eyeing up when to make his next wake jump crossing. That's our assumption anyway. And in doing so, loses sight of the buoy directly ahead of him. But the passengers have been completely habituated to passing close to buoys at high speed. They've been doing it all trip. There's nothing new. And so as a consequence, they don't shout a warning, raise the alarm until it is literally at the last moments and too late for anyone to do anything about it, when they realise that actually the boat isn't turning away and they're going to hit the buoy. So passing at high speed close to things is a no-no, and I think we've all probably done it at some point in the past, but we can learn from this and try and modify our behaviour. The boat was badly damaged, not surprising. 38 impact with a 2 or 3 ton steel mooring buoy is not going to do any good whatsoever. But what I wanted to focus on was the damage to the passengers, because they're not restrained in the way that people in a car in a high impact collision would be. And if I just quickly put up the details for the first row. So this is port 1, center 1 and starboard 1. And you can see that the injuries for the front row quite significant. 2 of them actually thrown forward into the water. P1, fairly plain exit into the water, just cuts and bruises. Center position, spinal injury, fracture to the thoracic number 11 vertebrae. Right leg fractured, left wrist fractured, severe bruising. Starboard seat, 5 fractured ribs on the left-hand side, bruising the arm and abdomen, damaged right knee. These are people who had nothing in front of them except handholds, and 2 of them were actually thrown over the side, but picked up these injuries on the way. The people in the middle seats, and I'll just put this up fairly quickly again, not too bad. The center one there, a closed fracture of the right radius and left cuboid, P3, small cut to hand, and so on. So not too much going on there. And in the back seats, ligament damage to the right thumb, heavy bruising to the thigh, soft tissue damage to the right knee, and wrist and bruising. So the people in the middle and aft row of jockey seats didn't come off too badly. They were quite constrained. The handholds were directly in front of them. It wasn't too far for them to travel. Unfortunately, the people in the bench seat at the back suffered really quite badly. On the left-hand side, displaced broken right wrist, compound fracture of the tibia, broken ribs on the left side under the breast and bruising in many areas. And this lady was bracing with a fixed arm to the handhold in front because it was that far away from her. So as the boat stopped in a hurry, that arm was fractured. The lady in the middle is the one who unfortunately died. She went forwards, the handhold took her below the rib cage, transected her liver, and she died of internal bleeding. And on the right side of the bench seat, broken left arm. Skipper didn't get away with it completely. He ended up with a dislocated right knee and bruising. But you can see the lack of crumple zones, the lack of airbags, the lack of seat belts, and so on, all the sort of things you'd expect in a car that protect you from this sort of collision. None of that is evident in a boat. Some of it perhaps for quite good reasons, but as a consequence, a high-speed impact is going to do a lot of damage to people inboard. This one, the characteristics I'll go through in a moment, but the picture top right, rib leaving Tobermory, rib sooty, again it's a report on our website, ran into this island at high speed at night. One of the passengers was thrown over the front of the boat and unfortunately struck his head on the rocks and suffered fatal injuries in doing so. So head-on collisions with a stationary object, characteristics. The impacting vessel rides up or potentially over the stationary object and or suffers rapid deceleration either from impact or loss of power. Passengers are thrown forward into the craft structure and could be ejected from the craft over the bow. And passenger injuries are consistent with road traffic head-on collisions, unrestrained. So head and facial injuries, impact injuries to the upper torso and upper limbs. Injuries can result in death, and significant arm, wrist, and shoulder injuries from bracing themselves if the position they are bracing themselves on is too far from where they're sitting and therefore their arms are locked out. So conclusions from that. Passengers and crew in small high-speed craft are very vulnerable to ejection from the craft, from motion-induced injury, from injury resulting from collisions with other craft and fixed objects. Suspension seats, if fitted, reduce the risks of motion-induced injury, but otherwise, current designs provide little protection to passengers and crew. And the need to hold on to mitigate the boat's sometimes violent motion can result in arm injuries involved in a collision. I think it's up to Richard and Rachel and so on to perhaps add comments about how that might impact on teaching. From my perspective, if you practice good behaviours, other people will follow your good behaviours, and so I think leading by example is what I would advocate and hope that other people follow on. So quite a meaty set of stuff. Not very many laughs in there, but I'm open to questions if anyone has any.